Chances are, if you've been on the internet for a while, you've come across something called a creepypasta. The name, while admittedly terrible, is actually a term for something fairly simple: internet campfire stories. Creepypastas were essentially scary short stories that you spread around the internet. Over time, though, their scope grew, and the emphasis on the short part of the definition got weaker and weaker over time. There are all sorts of creepypasta out there, some of which are very popular, but there's a subsection of creepypasta I'd like to bring attention to: the gaming subsection. With there being so many people who play video games, it should come to no shock that a large amount of creepypasta are based off of video games. However, it also shouldn't be a surprise that loads of these stories are rife with cliché. Even stories that the community praises as the best of the best have some big flaws in them. I've read a lot of creepypasta over the years, but I've never found one that grabbed me quite like The Princess. Upon first glance, you'd probably be confused as to why I'm so enamored in it. It appears to be just another haunted video game story. And while you wouldn't exactly be wrong about that, it would also be missing the point. I don't like The Princess because it's about a haunted video game. I like it because of what it does with the concept of a haunted video game. I highly recommend everyone just stop watching this video and just read The Princess. I'll be discussing a lot of the story, and it can be read through in about an hour, if that. Come back to this afterward. If you really don't want to read it, I'll provide a bit of a preface so you at least kind of know what's going on. So in the first chapter of the story, we're given the narrator's experience with the princess, and how he came across her. He states it just occurred randomly one day while he was playing Ocarina of Time. Upon meeting the princess, the game begins to act stranger and stranger, glitching out until it becomes unrecognizable. After a while of this, the narrator turns off the game, only for it to be perfectly normal from then on out. This first chapter on its own is a pretty serviceable, if run-of-the-mill, haunted video game story. If it was the only part of the story, I wouldn't be making this video, but of course, this isn't where it ends. The remainder of the story has the narrator take on a different role from regular creepypasta stories, because when it introduces the Princess Society, it really becomes about them and not the narrator. The Princess Society is an invite-only message board where people who have all seen the princess gather together to share their experiences with her and speculate on how to stop her. The narrator gets inducted into the forum after one of their members finds a post of his he made years ago, recounting his story from Chapter 1. This is where it gets interesting to me. I could totally believe people gathering together on a forum, bonding over this shared experience they all had. And the self-importance the narrator describes about the place sounds very realistic to me as well. Think about it. If you experience something only a handful of people in the world have, and then are told that thing is dangerous, wouldn't you feel a little high and mighty? I've spent a lot of time on the internet browsing forums like Game FAQs and FacePunch, so this angle really appealed to me personally. But the best part about this angle of the story is it gives us a good reason for knowing the things we know about the princess. A years-old forum that catalogs information about the being is actually fairly plausible. The information that gets cataloged is where we get a majority of our story, by the way. The narrator tells us about all kinds of things the forum has uncovered about the princess, most of which are retellings of other members' experiences, which I'll get into shortly. But before I do, I want to talk about Chapter 4, the rules. The chapter is basically just a copy-paste of the forum's rules for the princess and how she works. Some might say that giving a supernatural being like the princess rules demystifies her and makes her less scary, but I would disagree. I would say that these constraints help to contextualize the princess and make her more interesting. If there was no rhyme or reason to how she worked the way she did, that would be boring. That said, I can agree with the original statement of rules demystifying a creature to an extent. There's a chance that if the author shackles all these restraints on the monster, they'll make them less threatening, but thankfully Rocketlex, the author, manages to avoid this. In the story, the narrator admits that calling these restraints rules were a bit of a misnomer. They should have really been called observations because the term rules lulled the community into this false sense of security, thinking that the princess had to follow these guidelines to a T. Rocketlex honestly gets to have his cake and eat it too, since in fiction they're not necessarily rules, which make the characters still right to be afraid of her. which doesn't even take into consideration some of the people she's responsible for killing. To the reader, however, every rule that isn't broken might as well be taken at face value, which keeps the princess interesting as a monster. The Princess is a 14-part series, 13 if you count parts 0 and 13 as one due to their length. And while I would like to say that all of these parts are excellent, I'd be lying. There are sections of the story I found to be largely irrelevant and hurt the story overall. I think the most egregious example of this is Part 8, The Sisters. Part 8 is a recounting of a story about two sisters, the younger of the two coming across the princess in one of her video games. These visits the princess pays to the younger sister grow more and more unsettling until she's finally found dead, beaten to death. My biggest problem with this part of the story is it feels unnecessary. Just one part earlier, we found out how dangerous the princess could be when a story about one of the forum goers getting killed was told. That one not only came first, but fit much better in the story at large. Another thing that bothers me about this part is how is it we know so much about these two sisters? Outside of the forum posters when looking around, we don't really get an explanation. This entire part of the story could have been cut out if not for one part where the younger sister gives a small tidbit into the backstory of the princess. And the origin for the princess is another part of the story I'm a little lukewarm on. Ironically, the reason I'm lukewarm on it is the reason I was defending part 4. It demystifies the character. I'm not totally against backstories for these creatures, but I don't think the princess was a character that really needed one. At least not one as generic as haunted leftover code from a failed video game. The rules were good, but this origin story tips it a little too far for me. I wonder if with some adjustment the origin story could be removed entirely while keeping the final act of the story. On a first read, the princess's origin appears integral to the final part of the story, which I find to be enjoyable despite it being fairly similar to Ben Drowned, another creepypasta I'm sure you're all aware of. In this final act, the princess kills another victim on a live stream, this person being the head tester for the game she originated from. Perhaps if the origin story was cut, or at least drastically reduced, this section could still work. Wrapping this tester character in mystery wouldn't be too out of the ordinary either. Things got pretty negative there near the end, so you might be wondering why I find this to be my favorite creepypasta. And I suppose the answer to that is an insane bias. The Princess is a story that takes a tired concept and puts it in a novel setting, managing to succeed where other stories of its ilk failed. I loved the idea of an obscure invite-only internet forum regaling tales about their haunted video games so much I was able to look past some of the story's flaws. I even like the tagline of the story. I've been calling it The Princess this whole time, which is its name, but it's usually accompanied by the ominous, if you see her, turn off the game. It really manages to suck you in and even doubles as the premise. Even with all of these flaws and my bias set aside, I think the story is worth a read if you're looking for some good internet horror this month. Just be sure to be careful playing games from now on. You're aware of the princess now. And if you see her, turn off the game.